Why aren't men reading books? And more specifically, why aren't straight guys reading fiction? I've seen articles on this from the New York Times, The Guardian, CBC, GQ, and I've seen a few videos on this. And as a straight guy who has read hundreds and hundreds of novels over his life, I wanted to provide my perspective on why I think men aren't reading fiction. And I think it's a series of 5 cascading factors. This is a longer form of a video that I posted on TikTok, and I got a whole bunch of comments that were really insightful and some that were not insightful at all, but were actually really descriptive as to why men might not be reading and really showed what I was talking about. So I'm just going to go into these factors that I think are all cascading and overlapping as to why men are reading. Hopefully at the end I can provide some advice if you are a guy who isn't into fiction as to how to get started, why you should get into fiction, and if there are guys in your life that you want to keep reading and read with you, hopefully I can provide some advice too. And this is a really big subject, but hopefully this will provide a bit of an understanding of some of the pressures that guys are under. And yeah, let's get into it. The first factor is that no one is reading anymore of either gender. We live in a modern society where there are much more accessible forms of entertainment. You're watching this on YouTube. I'm on YouTube. There are video games, there's streaming, there's television, there's social media, there's a whole bunch of other things that are a lot more accessible and easy to get that dopamine hit of entertainment and seeing another story that aren't sitting alone in a room with a page that doesn't move. I think overall, as the articles that I cited at the start say, of the shrinking readership, fewer and fewer of those are men. And so there are specific factors that in this modern world are affecting men more than women. And I think that is what is driving this declining male readership in a world where readership in general is declining, which as a reader makes me sad that this art form that I really love is slowly going away. But hopefully we can explain it by going into some of the other factors. The second factor is that boys just aren't socialized to read in general. As a gender performance, boys are pushed outside towards sports, towards competition. Reading is not traditionally seen as a male activity. Women have traditionally been forced inside. They have a life of the mind to make up for this life of competition and sports. And so reading has been traditionally pushed towards women. You see this with book clubs, where you have Oprah's book club, or I think Reese Witherspoon has a new book club, where it's seen more as a feminine activity. This is reflected in my life, where in my one book club, I'm the only guy. In my horror book club, there are only a couple guys, where there's probably 90% women. Also, you see this in schools, where for both genders, people are taught less and less to read full books. They're taught how to interpret excerpts, but you have fewer and fewer boys that are going to liberal arts. They've traditionally been pushed more into the STEM fields, more into these things which are seen as practical, tangible, boy-like activities. You shouldn't have this sort of fictional, frivolous things that women are into, where these worlds don't even exist. And you've seen this discourse since the 19th century, where books were seen as a frivolous women's activity, that they just sit around the fireplace and read, whereas men accomplish and do things. And I think this overall socialization, by default, men would read books because men were just in control of society. But as we've had a stronger liberation of women throughout the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st, that sort of default mechanism that men would just pursue books because they controlled everything has become less and less, as women have been socialized more and more to read books, so boys are doing that less. And I think that's compounded the rise of this really rigid definition of masculinity that has become this reactionary movement in the rise of women's liberation, where you just have an increasingly narrow view of what being a man can be, and anything that is touched by women is automatically taken at. I think we saw this most in video games, where we had the whole Gamergate backlash at the beginning of the 21st century, where you had women who were talking about a feminist perspective that, hey, video games have been marketing traditionally towards men. Here are some problematic issues. And you had a bunch of guys that were very, very protective of what they saw as this male space. And again, you have video games, which are part of this modern world, which guys tend to be funneled into much more than girls are reading. And so you have this space, which is seen as traditionally masculine much more than books. Men and influencers like, I hate to say it, Andrew Tate, are pushing this masculinity where they just see books not as part of a male role model. You have to be hyper masculine, you have to lift weights, you have to do sports, you have to be in competition, and anything that distracts you from that is not worthwhile. Anything that is seen as even remotely feminine or being pushed by women is seen as toxic. And so you have male gamers in South Korea that see that comb through little graphics to see little feminist symbols, that they're too convinced that women are trying to take over everything. And so you have this really threatened, rigid view of masculinity that doesn't have the space to incorporate books and has become much, much worse, I think, in the social media age. So the socialization has become a hyper-socialization, this very rigid, fearful masculinity, because they see women as a threat that maybe they weren't at the turn of the 20th century. We live in a hyper-capitalist society where food is more expensive, shelter is more expensive, barely anyone can afford a home, you don't have a pension, you're just trying to compete in this world. Everyone is very affected by this, men and women alike, but I think, again, due to this socialization of men as being a breadwinner, as being a competitor, as almost being tied up in how well you succeed in this world, which is increasingly hyper-capitalist, it's just not seen as worthwhile to pursue fiction, because you have to be making six figures, you have to be succeeding in this world, and anything that distracts you from that is just not worthwhile. And you just see this, again, hyper-masculine influencers that are pushing this. So when you talk to men about what books they are reading, it's mostly self-help about how to succeed in this modern hyper-capitalist world, it's memoirs by successful celebrities, or it's historical nonfiction where you just have, oh, I'm reading more about the world, so that's very useful, but I wouldn't distract myself with fiction which doesn't have a use in this modern society to build myself as human capital and sell myself and sell my labor and become a capitalist myself. And so men are much more affected by this, whereas women have not been as, they are just as affected by hypercapitalism, but they've been socialized to see a more expanded view of their role in society as beyond a provider and a breadwinner and create arts. And you see this again, fewer men are going into liberal arts, whereas more women are, because they see this as a more expanded view of their role in society and might try to fight against that hypercapitalism, whereas guys seem again to be much more socialized into this precarious world and see it much more as a threat. And so you have this really strong thing. And I think, again, bringing out video games, because I neglected this in my TikTok and a lot of people were talking about this, is video games have an advantage because they are seen as primarily entertainment. They don't have this really serious side that books have. So I think men see books as it being, oh, there's the serious books and the frivolous books, and I will read the serious books to build myself. And when I want entertainment, I will do video games because A, those are coded as masculine, but B, those are just entertainment and they can just be entertaining. Why would I read books when I have this other thing? Books are for serious things. And then even in this hyper-capitalist view, you have video games becoming an increasingly good form of revenue for male streamers. And so again, that's seen as a way to make money, whereas being an author has never been a pathway to success, particularly now. So again, I think all of these factors combine to really pile on this really rigid hypermasculinity to just make reading not seen as a viable source in the world. Finally, the book market is a reflection of all of these factors, and it is going to bend to see that more women are reading than men in this hyper-socialized world, and so they're going to market slightly more towards women. You have genres like romantasy, which have taken over the front displays of bookstores, and you have more young adult fiction, which is primarily targeted towards young women, because again, many more young women are reading because of these factors. And when I talked about this, a lot of people were considering it a chicken and the egg problem. It's like, oh, men aren't reading because the book industry has been taken over by women and there aren't books for men. There have always been books for men. There will still continue to be published young adult fiction and modern literary fiction for men. It's just slightly less visible because women have become more part of that industry. And it's again because the publishing industry also isn't very profitable, so men don't go into it, so more women are in the publishing industry. It is not an organized feminist takeover. It is just a reflection of the society in which we live, where women are pushed more into these socialized roles like the book publishing industry. And I had people who were just like, well, look at the recent Booker list, where there was only one guy in the short list and the woman won. But there were 5 of the 13 in the long list were still men. The previous winners have been men. And so I think it just becomes this conspiracy where, again, fragile men think that women are pushing this thing against them, when really it's just a reflection of society. And there's still plenty of men publishing modern fiction. You have Mike McCormick doing a lot. You have Stuart Douglas who did Shuggie Bain. You have Colson Whitehead. You have Roland Everett. You've got a whole Percival Everett. You've got a whole bunch of people doing this stuff where you just like Marlon James. You have people doing this that I think, again, if you aren't paying attention, it looks like a whole conspiracy, but it's again just a reflection of all these factors cascading down. And you even saw this in the sci-fi community, which is again seen as like a male genre, but you had some racialized women who were winning prizes, and you had these sad puppies who were a bunch of reactionary sci-fi authors who were like, oh, well, this is the woke mob winning, so they tried to brigade and nominate their own nominees of really terrible fiction that wasn't winning because it was terrible and not particularly insightful. So again, this fragile masculinity that sees anything as touched by women as tainted, I think when the book market begins to reflect all these factors, men who are increasingly rigid and not curious about other perspectives aren't seeing that. I think an interesting sub factor that I saw reflected in a lot of comments in my TikTok was that men were unable to empathize with characters that weren't very hyper masculine men in fiction. Whereas traditionally, publishing has not been a women friendly activity, but you had plenty of girls reading high fantasy and sci fi, which basically had no female characters. And so men just seem to be more threatened and less open to new perspectives. And the problem is, fiction is all about immersing yourself in another perspective. And I don't think the hypermasculinity that exists is able to see something that will just appeal to men. And you need that entry level point of just being book for manly men. I guess that's modern and not Hemingway, that just men will not be interested in if they have had no exposure to fiction, which I think is very sad, but very reflective of all of these factors that I've discussed. So, how do we get past this? Well, I think in general, you just need to have a more expansive view of masculinity. For instance, I'm a very straight guy, but I wear nail polish just because I like it. But it's very funny how that immediately makes my masculinity question. And I think that's why in the book industry, when you talk about male authors and male readers, a lot of it are queer men because they have a much more expansive view of what masculinity can be. They feel a lot less threatened in their masculinity and they feel more open to books. And I think you see that very much reflected where the death of the straight male reader and writer is just because, again, we have this view of masculinity as not containing this. And it is a vicious circle where it is not a deliberate conspiracy to write less books, but man, it is a shrinking male readership that is caused by this. And there's still plenty of books out there for men. I read them all the time. It's just a very silly debate, but I think you need to have an expanded view of masculinity so you do not feel threatened and so you're open to new perspectives. So, how do we get these straight men reading fiction? Well, I found one way was to try to remind them that for centuries, book publishing was mostly a male activity, and you still have all of those old male authors still around. You had Dune, which is Frank Herbert's sci-fi epic, became a blockbuster movie. You had J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. You have Hemingway still out there. You have Updike. You have Irving. You have these men who have traditionally published books that appeal to men and just go for it. And I think reminding men that they're still out there, that they can start reading those classics. And again, men tend to value the classics much more nonfiction because, again, that's more useful as an economic citizen rather than reading something that isn't by consensus a masterpiece. But I also had men arguing in the comments, well, it's fine enough for the classic, but there's no new fiction being published by men, which again is very silly. You had Fosse just won the Nobel Prize, Nailsguard's still doing it, like Murakami, even though I'm not a fan of his work, is publishing very male-centric books, much to much criticism. So I think it's still out there, but again, men just aren't curious to look, but there's still plenty of looking to just recommend to your guy friends, hey, here are some guys that are publishing some male-focused fiction. It's easy for you, it's light. But if you are not used to reading novels, as again I said, overall, people aren't men and women alike, I think you would absolutely start with some short fiction. If you don't have the attention span to read books and you're more used to manga, video games, as I've had a lot of people in the comments say, read some short fiction. And I think the best way to start is with a cold shower of sci-fi, which more than any fiction is trying to create a whole new world and a new perspective to really shift your thinking. So read some Ted Chiang, read some China Miéville, read some male authors that are really, some Kim Stanley Robinsons that are really trying to push the envelope. And I think you can absolutely open up a whole new world. And short fiction doesn't require that much time. If you just think of the time that you spend streaming on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram, spend 15 minutes to read a sci-fi short story, and I promise you it will open up a whole new world. This is a hard problem to solve, and it's going to be an issue, I think, for as long as we have this really rigid understanding of gender and as long as we have social media, which is pushing this lost direction for boys. Boys, there's the male loneliness epidemic where you have fewer friends that are recommending books, fewer friends to be in your book club. So it's harder for men to socialize and do that part of books, which is seen as a lonely, more isolating experience. But I find books to be a really social thing. I can talk to my friends all the time about books, again, mostly women. So if you just open yourself up to books, open yourself up to fiction, just as much as video games, just as much as TV, as movies, they can be a whole new way to experience the world. And I love them because they take place entirely within your own head. You are guided into a whole new world. They can be just as fun thrillers, really fun adventures, in addition to literary fiction, which can just change your whole perspective on the world. So be open to books, talk to the men in your life about books, read them, and keep subscribed to my channel for some great book recommendations. And I will see you soon to hopefully talk about something that's a bit less dire and a bit more fun. But we need to keep fighting for this, and let's keep at it. Talk to you soon.